I left my husband and his entire family starving on New Year's Eve, and I've never slept better in my life. Let me paint the picture for you. There I was, standing in the frozen food aisle of a packed Minneapolis Walmart on December 31st, with a cart overflowing with groceries I couldn't afford. My phone was pressed against my ear, and Mark's voice was drilling into my skull like a jackhammer. He called me something I won't repeat, but the people in line with me heard it loud and clear. An elderly woman actually flinched. I was supposed to be preparing a feast for 8 people. People I hadn't invited, people who'd made my life hell for 5 years. And in that moment, surrounded by frozen turkeys and the judgmental stares of strangers, I realized something crystal clear. I was done. I hung up on him. I smiled at the elderly woman. And then I walked out of that store, leaving behind a full cart of food worth over $300 and approximately 5 years of obedience. What happened next changed everything. But to understand the explosion, you need to understand how the dynamite was laid. So stick with me, because this story gets wild. If you want to see how this all plays out, follow along here so you don't miss what comes next. The thing about toxic relationships is they don't start toxic. They start with charm. I met Mark Miller at a networking event in Chicago 7 years ago. I was 29, working my way up as an elementary school teacher with dreams of administration. He was a project manager at a construction firm, all broad shoulders and easy confidence. He knew how to work a room. More importantly, he knew how to work me. Within 6 months, we were married. Small ceremony, his choice. His mother, Brenda, wore cream to my wedding. Not white, she'd clarify if you asked, but cream. Close enough to make a statement. During her toast, she joked that she hoped I was better in the kitchen than I probably was with books. Everyone laughed. Mark squeezed my hand and whispered that his mom was just old-fashioned. I believed him. The first year was a performance. I played the role of the grateful wife, the one who'd landed a good man with a stable job. Mark controlled our joint account. My teacher's salary went in, his construction management salary went in, but somehow only he had the PIN. He'd give me an allowance for groceries. When I asked to see the statements, he'd kiss my forehead and tell me not to worry my pretty head about finances. Then my grandmother Rose died. She left me her apartment in downtown Minneapolis. 2 bedrooms, original hardwood floors, a balcony overlooking the Mississippi River. It was worth at least $400,000, free and clear. Mark's eyes lit up like slot machines. He wanted to sell it immediately, use the money for a house in the suburbs, something bigger, better. But Rose's apartment was the only thing I had that was truly mine. I'd spent childhood summers there, learning to bake in her kitchen, reading on that balcony. So I said no. I wanted us to move in and keep it. Mark's mask slipped for just a second. I saw something cold flicker across his face, but then he smiled and agreed. We moved into my grandmother's apartment, and that's when he brought in reinforcements. Brenda started visiting every single weekend. She'd show up Friday night with an overnight bag and her opinions. She'd inspect the apartment like a drill sergeant, running her finger along windowsills, opening my fridge and commenting on the lack of home-cooked meals. She'd mention how her friend's daughter just had twins. Wasn't that wonderful? Didn't I want to give Mark children? I had endometriosis. I'd explained this to Mark before we married. Some months, the pain left me unable to stand. Pregnancy might not even be possible. Brenda either didn't know or didn't care. Every visit included a comment about my empty womb. Mark's brother Todd joined the weekend invasions too, usually with his wife Rachel and their 2 boys. The kids would tear through my grandmother's carefully preserved apartment, breaking things, staining furniture. When I'd gently suggest they be more careful, Rachel would smile sweetly and say, "Kids will be kids." Mark never defended me. Not once. The financial abuse got worse. Mark bought a new truck without telling me, $35,000. He took Todd on a fishing trip to Alaska, $4,000. Meanwhile, I was using my credit card for groceries because the joint account was always mysteriously empty when I needed it. I started hiding money. $20 here, $50 there, cash back from grocery runs that I'd report as higher than they were. I opened a secret savings account at a different bank. It took me 2 years to save $8,000. $8,000 of my own salary that I had to hide from my own husband, but I still stayed, because leaving felt impossible. This was my apartment, my inheritance, but somehow Mark had made it feel like his kingdom. I was the ghost haunting my own life. Until that phone call in Walmart. His voice came through the speaker, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. He called me worthless. He called me lazy. He called me that word that made the elderly woman gasp, and then he ordered me to remember his mother's champagne and his nephew's gifts. I looked down at my cart. Expensive steaks, Mark demanded. Imported cheese Brenda required. Craft beer Todd preferred. Everything they wanted. Nothing I chose. I realized I'd become a servant in my own home. The phone was still pressed to my ear. Mark still ranting. I pulled it away, looked at his name on the screen, and felt absolutely nothing. No love, no fear, not even anger. Just a vast, exhausted emptiness. That's when I knew. I was done performing. I didn't go straight home after abandoning that cart. I sat in my car in the Walmart parking lot, engine running, heat blasting, watching snow accumulate on the windshield. My phone buzzed. Mark calling? I declined. It buzzed again. Brenda this time. Declined. A text from Todd's wife Rachel. Where are you? The boys are hungry. I turned my phone off. Instead, I drove to the one place I knew I'd find help. My coworker Diane lived 15 minutes away. She'd been teaching 4th grade for 20 years and had survived her own nightmare divorce. She'd seen the bruises on my spirit even when I tried to hide them. I showed up at her door, and she took one look at my face and pulled me inside. Her house smelled like cinnamon and safety. Over coffee, I told her everything. The control, the humiliation, the family invasions. She listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I'll never forget. Sarah, you know that apartment is yours, right? Legally, completely yours. Inheritance isn't marital property in Minnesota. I'd suspected this, but hearing it confirmed felt like someone had just handed me a loaded gun. Diane made a call. Within an hour, I was on the phone with her divorce attorney, Patricia Chen, who agreed to meet me the day after New Year's. She asked me one question. Do you want out? Yes, I said. The word came out strong and sure. Patricia explained my position. The apartment was mine, titled in my name only, inherited after marriage, but protected by Minnesota law. Mark had no claim to it. If I wanted him out, I could legally remove him. The divorce would be straightforward since we had no kids, no shared assets beyond a nearly empty joint account. She asked about abuse. Had he hit me? No. Threatened me. Not physically, but the control, the financial abuse, the systematic degradation. She said it all counted. She encouraged me to document everything. But I didn't want to document. I didn't want a lengthy court battle. I wanted something simpler and more immediate. I wanted them out of my house before midnight. Patricia warned me that spontaneous confrontations could be dangerous, but she also said that if I felt safe enough to do it, removing him on New Year's Eve sent a message. It was final, symbolic. The old year ended, and so did he. I sat in Diane's living room, drinking coffee, making a choice. I thought about every weekend spent cleaning up after Todd's kids, every dinner where Brenda criticized my cooking, every time Mark dismissed my pain about wanting children, every $20 bill I'd hidden in my bra because I couldn't access my own money. Diane reached across the table and squeezed my hand. She told me she'd be on standby. If things went wrong, if Mark became violent, I was to call her immediately and she'd call the police. I drove back to my apartment building at 8 p.m. The parking lot was full of cars I recognized. Mark's new truck, Brenda's sedan, Todd's SUV. My entire in-law family gathered in my home, waiting for me to serve them. I parked on the street instead, sat there for a moment, gathering courage. The Minneapolis skyline glittered beyond the river. Fireworks were already starting. Premature celebrations from people who couldn't wait for midnight. I walked into my building, took the elevator to the 3rd floor, and unlocked my door. The scene was exactly what I expected. Mark sprawled on my grandmother's couch, beer in hand, watching football. Todd beside him, doing the same. Brenda in the kitchen, opening cabinets, probably looking for something to criticize. Rachel on her phone, ignoring her kids as they jumped on my furniture. Nobody looked up when I entered. I was furniture to them, useful only when needed. Mark finally glanced over during a commercial. Where the hell have you been? And where's the food? I set my purse down carefully, took off my coat, folded it over my arm, and then I said the words I'd been practicing in the car. There is no food, and you all need to leave. The room went silent. Even the kids stopped jumping. Brenda emerged from the kitchen, her face twisted in confusion. She started to say something, but I cut her off. I informed them that this apartment was mine, that I'd consulted with an attorney, that Mark had no legal right to be here if I didn't want him here. And I absolutely did not want him here. Mark stood up, trying to loom over me like he always did when he wanted to intimidate me. He said I was being crazy, that I couldn't just throw him out, that this was his home too. I corrected him. I explained that we had no children, no shared property, and that Minnesota law was very clear about inherited property. This apartment, worth over $400,000, was mine alone. He had nothing. That's when Mark's face changed. The bluster faded. I saw calculation replace anger, and that's when I knew he'd been planning something. Mark didn't argue further. That should have been my first warning. Instead, he looked at Todd, then at Brenda, and something passed between them. Some silent communication that made my stomach turn. Brenda's expression shifted from shock to something almost smug. Mark's voice dropped into that reasonable tone he used when he was about to manipulate me. He suggested we talk privately in the bedroom, away from everyone. He said we could work this out, that I was just stressed, that we didn't need to do anything rash. Every instinct screamed at me to refuse, but I also needed to know what he was planning. So I agreed. But I left the bedroom door open, and I positioned myself near it. Once inside, Mark's mask cracked completely. He didn't plead or apologize. Instead, he made me an offer. If I agreed to sell the apartment, we could split the money and part ways peacefully. He'd even agreed to a quick divorce. I asked him why he suddenly cared about being peaceful. He'd spent 5 years making me miserable. Why negotiate now? That's when he said something that made my blood freeze. He told me that if I forced him out with nothing, things would get complicated. He had friends who were lawyers. He could make the divorce expensive and lengthy. He could claim that since he'd lived here for years and maintained the property, he deserved compensation. He could drag this out for months, maybe years. But there was something off about the threat. He delivered it without conviction, like he was reading lines someone else had written. And he kept glancing toward the living room, toward his mother and brother. I played along. I told him I'd think about his offer, that maybe selling wasn't the worst idea. I watched his shoulders relax slightly. He actually smiled, thinking he'd won. We returned to the living room, where Brenda and Todd were huddled together on the couch, whispering. They broke apart when we entered, their expressions too innocent. I announced that Mark and I needed time to discuss things, and that everyone should probably head home for the night. We could celebrate New Year's another time. Rachel immediately started gathering her kids, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. But Brenda protested, insisting that we shouldn't let a little argument ruin the holiday. Todd backed her up, suggesting we all just order pizza and move past this. That's when I noticed Brenda's purse sitting on my kitchen counter, partially open, and peeking out from inside was a corner of paper that looked distinctly legal. My heart started racing. I excused myself to use the bathroom, but instead I circled through the hallway and approached the kitchen from the other side. While everyone was distracted by the television, I quickly glanced into Brenda's purse. What I saw made my hands shake. It was a real estate listing for my apartment, printed from a website dated from 3 weeks ago. And there was a note in Mark's handwriting. Mom, broker says $425K minimum, $450K if we wait for spring. Split 4 ways like we discussed. Split 4 ways. Mark, Brenda, Todd, and Rachel. They'd been planning to sell my apartment all along. They'd probably been planning it since my grandmother died. The weekend invasions, the constant presence, Mark's insistence that this was our home. It was all part of establishing occupancy, making it seem like a family property. But there was more in that purse. Under the listing was a document I didn't have time to fully read, but I caught the header. Quit-claim deed. My vision blurred with rage. They were going to try to force me to sign over my apartment. I heard footsteps approaching, so I quickly moved away from the purse and headed to the actual bathroom. I locked the door, sat on the edge of the tub, and tried to breathe. My whole body was shaking, but not from fear, from fury. These people had been systematically working to steal my inheritance. The emotional abuse, the financial control, the constant belittling. It was all designed to break me down until I'd sign whatever they put in front of me. but they'd made one critical mistake. They'd underestimated how much I could endure before I broke, and they'd miscalculated which direction I'd break. I pulled out my phone and texted Diane, "Need you to do something for me? Call my apartment in 5 minutes and pretend to be my attorney with urgent news." She responded immediately, "On it." I flushed the toilet, washed my hands, and returned to the living room with a calm expression. Mark was back on the couch, comfortable and confident. Brenda had retrieved her purse and was clutching it a little too tightly. Exactly 5 minutes later, my phone rang. I answered with a professional tone, saying hello to Patricia. Diane played her part perfectly, and I responded with a series of "I understand" and "yes, that's correct" statements. When I hung up, everyone was watching me. I announced that my attorney had just informed me of something interesting. According to Minnesota statute, any attempt to coerce someone into transferring property through fraud or undue influence was not only grounds for civil action, but could potentially be criminal, especially if there was documentation of premeditation. Mark's face drained of color. I continued, explaining that my attorney had advised me to secure any documents that might be relevant to establishing such intent. And I looked directly at Brenda's purse as I said it. Brenda clutched the bag closer, but the damage was done. They all knew that I knew. The room erupted. Todd started shouting that I was crazy, that I was paranoid. Rachel grabbed her kids and headed for the door. Brenda tried to claim that the listing was just her being curious about property values, that it meant nothing. But Mark said nothing. He just stared at me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or shame. It was assessment. He was trying to figure out how much I actually knew and what I could prove. I told them all to leave. Now. Or I would call the police and report an attempted property fraud. I'd also call Patricia Chen for real, and we'd see how interested the Hennepin County Attorney's Office was in a conspiracy between a husband and his family to defraud a wife out of her inheritance. This time, nobody argued. Todd practically dragged Brenda to the door. Mark grabbed his jacket without a word. As Mark reached the threshold, he turned back to me and said I'd regret this, that I had no idea what I'd just started. But I did know. I'd started my freedom, and I wasn't done yet. The apartment felt impossibly large after they left. I stood in the middle of the living room, listening to the silence, waiting for the adrenaline to fade. It didn't. I couldn't stay there that night. The thought of sleeping in a space they'd contaminated with their plans made my skin crawl. I packed a bag and drove back to Diane's house, where she and her husband welcomed me with wine and a guest room. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept circling back to that quitclaim deed in Brenda's purse. They'd brought it with them. They'd planned to get me to sign it tonight, probably after enough drinks to make me compliant. Maybe during some fake reconciliation scene Mark would orchestrate. The next morning, January 1st, I called Patricia Chen at her home. She'd given me her personal number for emergencies, and this qualified. I told her everything. The listing, the deed, the split 4 ways note. Patricia was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that changed everything. "Sarah, I need you to think carefully. In the past 5 years, has Mark ever had you sign documents without fully explaining them? Especially financial documents?" My stomach dropped. Yes, multiple times. He said they were tax papers or insurance updates. I trusted him. Patricia's voice sharpened. "We need to find out what you signed. Can you access the apartment today while Mark's not there?" I told her I could. It was my apartment. I had every right. She instructed me to photograph every document I could find, bank statements, contracts, anything with my signature. She also told me to check the public records for my property to see if any documents had been filed that I didn't know about. I spent January 1st conducting the most important investigation of my life. Mark had texted me that morning saying he was staying at Todd's and that we'd talk after I calmed down. Perfect. That gave me time. I returned to the apartment and started searching. Mark had a home office that he'd claimed was off limits to me because of confidential work documents. I'd respected that boundary for 5 years. Not anymore. In his desk drawer, under a pile of construction permits, I found a folder labeled Property Rose Apartment. Inside were documents that made me physically ill. There was a refinance application for the apartment, in my name, with my forged signature. It had been denied because the loan officer had called me directly to verify, and I'd told them I'd never applied for a refinance. I'd assumed it was identity theft and had frozen my credit. I'd never connected it to Mark. There was worse. I found a home equity line of credit application, also in my name, also with what looked like my signature. This one had been submitted to a different bank. I had no idea if it had been approved. At the bottom of the folder was a document that made me sit down hard in Mark's office chair. A will. My will. Dated 2 years ago, leaving everything to Mark in the event of my death. I'd never written a will. The signature was good. Better than the other forgeries. Someone had practiced. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone to photograph everything. But I did. Every page, multiple angles, clear shots of the signatures. Then I went to my county's public records website and searched my property address. That's when I found that the home equity line of credit had been approved 15 months ago for $75,000. Mark had taken out a loan against my apartment without my knowledge, using a forged signature. $75,000 that I'd never seen, never authorized, but was legally responsible for because my name was on the deed. I called Patricia immediately. She told me not to panic, that we had clear evidence of fraud, and that this actually strengthened my position. Mark had committed multiple crimes: forgery, identity theft, loan fraud. This wasn't a difficult divorce anymore. This was criminal. But Patricia also warned me that confronting Mark directly could be dangerous. Men who commit financial crimes against their wives don't always respond rationally when caught. She advised me to file a police report first, then proceed with the divorce under protection of a restraining order. I was about to agree when I found one more thing. In Mark's email, which he'd stupidly left logged in on his computer, there was a thread with Todd and Brenda from 6 months ago. The subject line was, "Rose property plan, final details." I read every message. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Mark would slowly convince me that I was a bad wife, unstable, possibly depressed. He'd document incidents of me forgetting things or overreacting. Brenda would back up his claims. Once I was broken down enough, Mark would suggest marriage counseling. The counselor would be someone Brenda knew, someone who could be convinced that I needed serious help. If I still resisted signing over the apartment, Plan B was to have me committed for a psychiatric evaluation. In Minnesota, a spouse can initiate a 72-hour hold if they claim their partner is a danger to themselves. Those 72 hours would be enough to file emergency financial documents claiming I was incapacitated. And if I died, naturally or otherwise, the forged will would ensure everything went to Mark anyway. I read those emails 3 times, making sure I understood correctly. They'd been planning to either gaslight me into giving up my inheritance, or failing that, have me declared mentally incompetent. The quit-claim deed in Brenda's purse last night was Plan C. Get me drunk, get me emotional, get me to sign during a moment of weakness. I sat in Mark's office chair, surrounded by evidence of his crimes, and felt something I hadn't felt in years. Powerful. Because now I didn't just want a divorce. I wanted justice. I spent the next 3 days building my case like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Patricia connected me with a detective in the Minneapolis Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. His name was Detective Ramirez, and he'd seen cases like mine before, spouses who systematically defrauded their partners, often with family assistance. I gave him everything: the forged refinance application, the fraudulent home equity line of credit, the emails outlining their plan, the fake will. Detective Ramirez photographed each document, his expression growing darker as the evidence mounted. He explained what would happen next. The DA's office would review the case. If they agreed there was sufficient evidence, and Ramirez believed they would, arrest warrants would be issued. For Mark, certainly. Possibly for Brenda and Todd, too, depending on their level of involvement. But there was a catch. These cases moved slowly. It could take weeks or even months before charges were filed, and in the meantime, Mark would likely realize I'd discovered everything and either flee or destroy evidence. Detective Ramirez suggested I get a restraining order immediately and change all my locks. He also recommended I freeze all my credit lines and file disputes on the fraudulent home equity loan. I did all of that, but I also did something else. I went back to that email thread between Mark, Brenda, and Todd, and I found references to a specific date: January 15th, 2 weeks away. That was the day they'd planned to make the final move. The emails were vague about what exactly that meant, but there was mention of a meeting with B's attorney friend and getting S to the right headspace. They were planning something for January 15th, some final attempt to get control of my property. I called Patricia and asked what we could do to turn the tables. She thought for a moment, then smiled. She told me that in her experience, the best way to stop a conspiracy was to make the conspirators think they'd already won. We crafted a plan. On January 4th, I sent Mark a text. I told him I'd been thinking about everything and that maybe he was right. Maybe I was being irrational. Maybe we should talk about our options, including selling the apartment. I suggested we meet for coffee to discuss things calmly. Mark responded within minutes. He said he was glad I was being reasonable and that he'd always loved me, that this whole thing had just gotten out of hand. The manipulation in that text was so obvious I almost laughed. We arranged to meet on January 8th at a coffee shop in uptown Minneapolis, neutral territory. But I wouldn't be going alone. Patricia arranged for a colleague, another divorce attorney named Marcus Webb, to be at the coffee shop at the same time, seated nearby with recording equipment. Minnesota is a one-party consent state for recording, but Patricia wanted everything documented clearly. She also had me wear a recording device, a small microphone clipped to my bra strap. Between Marcus's equipment and mine, we'd capture everything Mark said. The goal was simple: get him to talk about the fraud, get him to admit to forging documents or taking out the loan without my knowledge, get him to reference the plan to have me committed or the fake will. Patricia warned me that Mark might not confess to anything incriminating, but she suspected that if he thought I was broken and willing to cooperate, he might let his guard down enough to reveal something useful. January 8th arrived. I dressed carefully, not too put together, not too disheveled. I wanted to look like someone who'd been crying but was trying to hold it together. A woman on the edge of surrender. I arrived at the coffee shop early and chose a table in the back. Marcus was already there, laptop open, looking like any other remote worker. He didn't acknowledge me. Mark showed up 15 minutes late. He sat down across from me and immediately launched into the role of concerned husband. He said he'd been worried about me, that he hated fighting, that maybe we'd both said things we didn't mean. I played my part. I told him I'd been overwhelmed and emotional, that I'd overreacted on New Year's Eve, that I'd been talking to Diane too much, and she'd been putting ideas in my head about divorce and independence. Mark's expression brightened. He reached across the table and took my hand. He said he understood that I'd been through a lot since Grandma Rose died, that grief could make people act irrationally. Then he lowered his voice and said, "Maybe I should talk to someone professional." He knew a therapist through his mother, someone who specialized in helping women through difficult transitions. There it was, the first step in their plan. The therapist who would eventually recommend psychiatric evaluation. I pretended to consider it. Then I said something that made Mark's eyes light up. Maybe you're right. Maybe I do need help. And maybe holding on to Rose's apartment is keeping me stuck in the past. Mark squeezed my hand. He said he was so glad I was finally seeing things clearly. That selling the apartment would be good for both of us. Fresh start, new home, moving forward together. I asked him what he thought we should do with the money from the sale. He didn't hesitate. He said we could split it. Or better yet, invest it in a property we chose together. Something in the suburbs where we'd have more space, maybe for a family eventually. I pushed a little further. I mentioned that I'd seen something about a home equity line of credit on the apartment when I was going through mail. Did he know anything about that? Mark's face didn't change, but I saw his jaw tighten. He said there must be some mistake, that he didn't know anything about any loan. Probably identity theft or a banking error. I nodded like I believed him. Then I said I was worried because if there was a loan I didn't know about, it could complicate selling the apartment. That's when Mark made his first major mistake. He told me not to worry about it, that he'd handle any complications with the title, that he had connections in the real estate world who could smooth things over. How would he handle title complications on a fraudulent loan unless he knew about it? We talked for another 30 minutes. Mark painted a beautiful picture of our future. The suburbs, maybe kids, definitely a bigger house. All I had to do was trust him and work with him to sell the apartment. As we were leaving, he hugged me, whispered in my ear that he loved me and that everything would be okay. I hugged him back and felt absolutely nothing. January 15th arrived faster than I expected. Mark had been texting me regularly since our coffee meeting, playing the role of supportive husband. He suggested we meet with a real estate agent he knew, someone who could give us a fair assessment of the apartment's value. The meeting was scheduled for 3 p.m. at the apartment. Mark said his mom might stop by too, just to offer support during this difficult decision. Of course she would. But I'd made my own arrangements. At 2:30 p.m., Detective Ramirez and his partner arrived at my apartment building in an unmarked car. Patricia was with them. So was a uniformed officer from the Minneapolis PD, just in case things got physical. We reviewed the plan one more time. Mark, Brenda, and probably Todd would arrive expecting to pressure me into signing documents. Instead, they'd be met with arrest warrants. The DA had moved quickly once they saw the evidence. Mark was being charged with forgery, identity theft, and loan fraud. Brenda and Todd were charged as accomplices to fraud based on the emails showing their participation in planning the scheme. At 2:55 p.m., we heard footsteps in the hallway. Multiple people. I opened the door before they could knock. Mark stood there with Brenda on one side and a man I didn't recognize on the other. Todd was behind them with his usual sneer. The stranger introduced himself as Robert Keller, a real estate broker and family friend. He was holding a folder that I knew contained documents they expected me to sign. Mark looked past me into the apartment and froze. He'd spotted Detective Ramirez standing in my living room. His face went through a rapid series of changes: confusion, recognition, fear. Detective Ramirez stepped forward and identified himself. He informed Mark that there was a warrant for his arrest on charges of forgery, identity theft, and fraud. Mark's response was immediate and predictable. He turned to run. Todd actually tried to grab the detective's arm to stop him from pursuing Mark. That was a mistake. The uniformed officer stepped forward and had Todd on the ground in handcuffs in about 5 seconds. The second officer moved to intercept Mark, who'd made it maybe 3 steps before realizing he had nowhere to go. Brenda started screaming. She claimed this was all a misunderstanding, that her son would never do such things, that I was a vindictive liar who was framing them because I was mentally unstable. Detective Ramirez calmly read Mark his rights while his partner did the same for Todd. Then Ramirez turned to Brenda and informed her that she was also under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud. Her face went sheet white. She looked at me with an expression of pure hatred and hissed that I'd destroyed her family. I looked her right in the eyes and said, "You destroyed yourself the moment you tried to steal my inheritance." The real estate broker, Robert Keller, was backing away slowly, holding up his hands and insisting he didn't know anything about fraud, that he was just here for a property consultation. Patricia stepped forward and informed him that the DA's office would want to speak with him about his role in this scheme. His presence here with documents suggested he was part of the conspiracy. His protests were impressive, but Patricia handed him her card and told him to have his attorney contact her office. As the police led Mark, Brenda, and Todd out in handcuffs, neighbors came to their doorways. Some filmed the scene on their phones. Others just stared. Mark looked back at me one last time before they took him down the hallway. He didn't look angry anymore. He looked confused, like he genuinely couldn't understand how I'd outsmarted him. That was the moment I realized what he'd never understood. He'd always assumed I was weak because I'd been kind. He'd confused patience with stupidity, tolerance with ignorance. After they were gone, I stood in the doorway of my apartment, my grandmother's apartment, my inheritance, my home, and felt a wave of exhaustion mixed with triumph. Patricia put a hand on my shoulder and told me the legal process would take months, but the criminal charges would move forward. Mark would likely take a plea deal rather than go to trial. The fraudulent home equity loan would be discharged since I could prove I never authorized it. The apartment was mine, free and clear. I closed the door and walked to the balcony. The Mississippi River stretched out below, the same view my grandmother had loved, the same view Mark had tried to steal from me. Fireworks were going off somewhere in the distance, left over from some celebration. I watched them bloom in the winter sky and thought about how different my life would be now. 6 months later, Mark took a plea deal. 5 years probation, restitution for the fraudulent loan amount, and a permanent restraining order keeping him away from me. Brenda and Todd got lighter sentences, 2 years probation each, but the public humiliation was almost worse for them than jail time would have been. The divorce was final within 3 months of Mark's arrest. He signed every paper without argument, probably on advice from his attorney, who knew fighting would only add more criminal exposure. I kept the apartment, obviously. But I also made some changes. I repainted every room, replacing Mark's bland beiges with colors my grandmother would have loved: deep blues, warm terracottas, sage greens. I replaced the furniture he'd chosen with pieces from estate sales and antique shops. I filled the balcony with plants. The apartment stopped being the place where I'd been trapped and became the place where I'd won my freedom. My job at the school became easier too. I'd been so consumed by my toxic home life that I hadn't realized how much it was affecting my work. Now, free from that weight, I threw myself into a district program developing literacy curriculum. I was promoted to assistant principal within 4 months, but the biggest change was something I'd never expected. Using the savings I'd hidden from Mark, that $8,000 I'd squirreled away, I invested in something I'd always dreamed of but never had the courage to pursue: my own business. My grandmother had taught me to bake when I was young. Her kitchen had always smelled like fresh bread, cinnamon rolls, fruit pies. Those summers with her, learning her recipes, were some of my happiest memories. The ground floor of my apartment building had a vacant commercial space. It had been empty for years, used for storage. I approached the building owner, a woman who'd watched the police arrest Mark and had heard the whole story, and negotiated a lease. I named the bakery Rose's Revival, my grandmother's name and a nod to my own resurgence. The renovation took 3 months. I did a lot of the work myself, painting walls, installing shelves, learning to use commercial baking equipment. Diane helped on weekends. So did some of my colleagues from school and neighbors from the building who'd become friends once I was no longer isolated by Mark's control. We opened on a Saturday in July. The line stretched around the block. I specialized in the things my grandmother had taught me: sourdough bread, cinnamon rolls, fruit pies made with seasonal Minnesota produce. But I also experimented, creating fusion pastries that blended my southern roots with Minneapolis's diverse food culture. The bakery gave me something I'd lost during my marriage: joy. Every morning, I'd wake up at 4 a.m. to start the first batches of bread. The physical work was exhausting, but it was mine. The success or failure depended entirely on my effort, my choices, my recipes. Within 2 months, Rose's Revival was profitable. Within 4, we'd been featured in Minnesota Monthly magazine. Within 6, I was hiring staff and considering a second location. But success wasn't the best part. The best part was the community that formed around the bakery. Neighbors would stop in for their morning coffee and tell me about their lives. Regulars would bring their kids and let them pick out cookies. I'd host book clubs and knitting circles in the seating area. I'd spent 5 years trapped in isolation, and now I was surrounded by connection. One afternoon in late November, almost a year after that Walmart parking lot epiphany, I was closing up the bakery when a woman walked in. She was young, maybe mid-20s, and she looked exhausted in a way I recognized. She asked if we were still open. I told her we were closed, but she could come in anyway. She sat at one of the tables and started crying. Between sobs, she told me her story: a controlling boyfriend, financial abuse, isolation from friends. She said she'd been walking past the bakery and saw the name Rose's Revival, and something about it made her feel like she should come in. I sat down across from her. I didn't tell her what to do or judge her choices. I just listened, and when she was finished, I told her my own story. Not all of it, but enough. Enough to let her know she wasn't alone. That escape was possible, that survival could become thriving. I gave her Patricia Chen's card. I told her about resources for women leaving abusive relationships. And I gave her a cinnamon roll to go because sometimes small kindnesses matter as much as big ones. She left looking a little less broken than when she'd arrived. That became my new normal. Every few weeks, someone would come into Rose's Revival carrying the weight of a toxic relationship or family trauma. And I'd listen. Sometimes I'd share my story. Sometimes I'd just offer coffee and a safe space to cry. My grandmother had used her kitchen to feed people's bodies. I was using her legacy to feed their spirits too. Today, as I lock up the bakery and head upstairs to my apartment, I sometimes pause on the balcony. I look out at the Mississippi River, at the Minneapolis skyline, at the life I've built from the ruins of my marriage. I think about that woman in the Walmart parking lot, shaking and afraid, hanging up on her abusive husband. I think about Mark's voice on the phone, calling me that word, assuming I'd obey like I always had. I think about the moment I chose differently. Recovery isn't linear. Some days I still feel angry about the years I lost. Some nights I dream about the confrontation, the fear, the uncertainty. But most days now, I feel free. Mark took 5 years from me, but he also gave me something valuable: the knowledge of exactly how strong I am, how much I can survive, how completely I can rebuild. I learned that kindness isn't weakness, that patience isn't ignorance, that being underestimated is sometimes the greatest advantage. And I learned that the best revenge isn't dramatic or violent. It's building a life so beautiful that the person who tried to destroy you becomes irrelevant to your happiness. If you're listening to this from somewhere in the world, struggling in your own situation, wondering if you have the strength to leave, let me tell you something. You do. You absolutely do. It might not feel like it right now. It might feel impossible, terrifying, overwhelming. But that's what they want you to feel. That's how they keep you trapped. The truth is simpler and stronger than you think. You deserve safety. You deserve respect. You deserve to wake up without fear and go to sleep without anxiety. You deserve to own your own life. And when you're ready, not when anyone else says you should be ready, but when you're ready, you'll find that strength you didn't know you had. You'll surprise yourself. You'll surprise everyone. I did. And my life now is more beautiful than I ever imagined it could be. If you're listening from Minneapolis or anywhere else, stop by Rose's Revival sometime. First coffee's on me. And if you need to talk, I'm here. To everyone who followed this story from that first chapter where I walked out of Walmart, thank you. Thank you for witnessing my journey. For those of you fighting your own battles, I'm rooting for you. Drop a comment telling me what city you're listening from. I love knowing how far these stories travel. And if this story resonated with you, subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like mine out there, stories of survival and strength, and they deserve to be heard. Here's to new beginnings. Here's to reclaimed lives. Here's to every person who ever thought they were trapped and found their way out. You're stronger than they told you. You're worth more than they made you believe. And your story isn't over. It's just beginning.